Chapter 1. Chapter 1 of our textbook, which is Environment, the Science Behind the Stories by Withgott and La Posada, is an introduction to our course and to what sustainability is. The first sticky note that you should put in your book to match the ones from this book are on page 3, and there's two definitions to know. The first is environmental science, and the second is ecosystem services. So environmental science is the study of how the natural world works and how the environment affects us and how we affect our environment and how we interact with it. But it's about the science of it. It is not environmental studies. It is not environmentalism. It is not about activism. It's about the science behind what we know about our Earth. And we're going to do a ton of science this year. An ecosystem service is something that nature gives us as humans for either survival, like the air we breathe, or gives us an economic benefit, like trees provide lumber that we can sell for money. Ecosystem services is something that we will come back to again and again. Going on to page 4, know this figure and caption here about renewable and non-renewable resources. So in this first two columns are renewable, which means that they come back. They are not going to be depleted. The first one is things that come back every day or almost every day. The second column here under my sticky note shows ones that come back, but you have to wait a little bit. Like fresh water, you have to wait for the rain. Forest products, like if you cut down a pine tree, you have to wait 20 years for a new one to grow. And a crop, you have to wait for that crop to grow over several months. And soils they take about 100 years to replenish an inch of topsoil. So it is renewable, it just takes a little bit longer in this column. And this last column are things that are non-renewable, which means that when they're gone, at least for the span of humanity. So the first three are our fossil fuels, crude oil, natural gas, and coal. And fossil fuels take millions of years under heat and pressure to form. So they are non-renewable because we really say that humans will not be able to access them again when they're gone. And then you have your metals there too, your minerals and your metals. You need to know about the agricultural revolution that began 10,000 years ago. And this caused a shift in population growth. The next shift in human population growth occurred in the mid-1700s with the Industrial Revolution. And down here on this graph, you can see that the agricultural revolution did a little bit of a spike with population, but the Industrial Revolution gave a big spike with population. And it has to do with, during this time, we started growing better foods, we started having better medicine, and we basically dropped the death rate. And then it takes a little while for the birth rate to drop to match it, and during that time you have rapid population growth. We'll study this more in chapter 8. So when I have a thing here that says know this figure and caption, it means really understand it. The captions are super important. So much information that you will need to know for your exam and the AP test are in captions. A lot of students skip the figures and captions, and they're honestly the most important part of a textbook. You can get huge amounts of information by just reading the figures and captions. Over here is the concept of an ecological footprint, which is basically the amount of land and water needed to support a person, with the things that they eat, what they wear, the water that they use, all of that. And so again, know these figures and know these captions which talk about ecological footprints. You also need to know the concept of overshoot. So make sure that you know an ecological footprint, biocapacity, and overshoot. next page talks about Easter Island. And so we have here two theories as to what happened. So when Easter Island's population used to be big, and we know this from, we dig up fossils and we find that there used to be palm trees that are no longer there, and we know from their records, well, they don't have written records, but we can go there and have evidence in other ways that it used to have a pretty large population. And what happened? So for a long time, in fact, our old textbooks that we used starting in 2006 had just theory number 1, and that's all the students learned. And then we switched textbooks in 2015, and now there's more research in that we have now theory number 2 as to what happened to the population on Easter Island. So which one is true? Again, they're both theories and they'll take more research to find out. But you do need to know both theories and how it applies to sustainability. So theory number 1 is that the islanders did not practice sustainability, that they deforested their land so they could build these statues. And the statues are made out of stone, but they haul them using logs, and they roll them along using logs. And so when deforestation happened, the trees were no longer there, their roots were no longer there to hold the soil in place. You had soil erosion, which brought down crop yield, so they didn't have enough to eat, and then they had famine, and then they killed each other in the different villages and tribes. The second theory, which is the newer theory based on evidence, is that the Polynesians, when they landed on Easter Island from other islands, brought with them rats. And disease wiped out their food supply, but they learned how to live sustainably. And then their population just really got worse when European sailors came and took some of them for slaves and also brought European diseases. All right, the next page talks about how environmental science is interdisciplinary. We are going to learn about all of these things, including a lot of social sciences in this course, and it makes it a very interesting course. So your book talks about DDT, and it shows here this girl getting sprayed with DDT. Seems crazy to us today that we would spray a kid with pesticide like that to get rid of lice or other problems. But they didn't know back then the problems with these chemicals. They thought chemicals were the answer to so many problems. Now we know that DDT is bad, and it is banned in the US because it kills birds. Basically, it weakens the eggshells, so when the mama and daddy birds sit on the eggs crack, and then no babies are born. And after a while, if you have no babies born, then your species will disappear. And so a lot of your top predatory birds, like bald eagles and peregrine falcons and ospreys, they became endangered because of DDT. So we banned DDT a few decades ago, and their populations are recovering now. But is DDT bad everywhere? So we also know that it's the best pesticide to kill mosquitoes. And malaria is carried by mosquitoes, and it's a hugely enormous problem in places like Africa. So should we ban it everywhere? So that's an interesting question. In our course, we don't have a lot of things that are just black and white, and there's a lot of things that are kind of in between, that in some instances are good and in some instances are bad. And a lot of things like nuclear power has both positives and negatives, and we're going to talk a lot about those. But then there are other instances where things are just always bad. All right, going on to page 10, it talks about the scientific method, which you've had in other science classes for a long time. Do know all the bold words on this page. Know what a hypothesis is, what your variables are, your independent and your dependent variables, a controlled experiment, what a control is, what a treatment is, what data is. And again, these are all review terms, but we are going to hit them hard this year in this course because the AP exam will expect you to write about an experiment and use these terms correctly, and we will practice that a lot this year. Know the difference between a manipulative and a natural experiment. So in our course, we can do manipulative experiments in a lab, but sometimes we're going to go out in nature and make observations, and these are considered natural experiments. All experiments should undergo something called peer review, because without peer review, you end up with faulty science. One of the problems that we've had in modern days has to do with vaccines. There was a study that came out that only studied a few kids with autism, and the doctor said, oh, there's a link between vaccines and autism. And it did not go under peer review. It got published by mistake in a very famous scientific journal, which then said, oh, we made a mistake. We should not have published that article because there was no other evidence backing up this claim. But the problem is the claim became out there in the news and it confused a lot of people. And we'll talk about vaccines later on in chapter 14. But the thing is that unless you undergo peer review, where other scientists take a look at your work and make sure that you did your science correctly, without that, anybody could publish anything. And that causes big problems. All right, know this figure and caption. Most papers undergo strict review in the scientific community, but some do not, and then they make the news. There's another one that has to do with hugging your dogs. And again, it wasn't peer reviewed, but it made the news, and it got all these people thinking they shouldn't be hugging their dogs. So do be careful. We're going to teach about that this year, about the news, and make sure you go to the source of where the data was collected. And you're going to learn what good data is this year. On page 14, you need to know the definition of sustainability, which is using resources without depleting them, leaving behind an intact ecosystem for the future. And that is the goal. How do we use our resources? This isn't about not using them, never using wood or paper or water, but how do we use them so we don't actually deplete them and they come back for future generations? And that is it for chapter 1.